number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Minutes.
Society of Antiquaries of London, Ordinary Meeting, Thursday, 28th of October, 2021, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 21st of October, 2021 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society and ordered to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society. English Landscapes and Identities by Professor Chris Gosden, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting will be on Thursday, 4th of November, then closed the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Following the results of today's ballot, I declare the following are duly elected Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London: Elizabeth Bacordano, Rufus Bird, Christopher Bragg, Rhiannon Corno, Claire Downham, Dennis Duncan, David Fell, Mary Flannery, Anna Forrest, Christa Gardner von Teufel. Certificates.
Anne-Marie Akehurst, BA, PGC, MA, PhD, an independent researcher working on early modern architecture. Angela Boyle, MA, PhD, a consultant osteologist whose work spans the Neolithic to the post-medieval period over much of Britain. Laura Fernandez González, BA, MA, PhD, lecturer at the University of Lincoln and art and architectural historian of the early modern Iberian world. Catherine Freeman, BA, MST, DPhil, senior lecturer in European archaeology at the Australian National University, specializing in the landscape and material culture of later European prehistory. Isaka Joshua, MA, PhD, Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame, working on British folklore and European myth. Lillian Ladle, MBE, Visiting Research Fellow in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology at Bournemouth University, awarded an MBE for services to Dorset archaeology.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Before I introduce our speaker, just some housekeeping. There will be a Q&A session at the end. We will be taking questions both from the room and on Zoom and YouTube, and apparently there are about 80 people joining us on those media. If anybody would like to ask a question online, please type it into the chat function on Zoom or YouTube, and I will ask as many as we can at the end of the lecture. For those of you in the room, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone before beginning, because if you don't speak into the microphone, the people on Zoom won't hear your question. So today's lecture, Khotan, a Neglected Silk Road Kingdom by Professor Susan Whitfield. Susan Whitfield is a scholar, writer and traveller, currently Professor in Silk Road Studies at the University of East Anglia and Honorary Associate Professor at UCL. She previously spent 25 years at the British Library, curating their collection of over 50,000 Central Asian manuscripts. During this period, she helped found and then directed an international project to make archaeological artifacts from East and Central Asia scattered in collections worldwide, freely available online. She's written numerous books and articles, traveled widely, including field trips to Taklamakan, which I cannot pronounce, and curated several international exhibitions. Susan, thank you very much.
say first what a pleasure it is to be at an actual meeting of actual people, but hello to all of you online, and I'm very glad you can join us today as well. And yeah, it's nice to have both now, so that those of you further away can also take part. I want to thank the Society for inviting me to give this talk this evening. I must also thank the Leverhulme Trust, who've provided emeritus fellowship, which has enabled much of my research in the archives on this topic. The funds were also awarded to carry out a field trip in the Taklamakan Desert at a site of Khotan, which I hadn't yet managed to visit, site of Dandan Oilik. We'll look at it briefly today. I mean, sadly, because of the political persecution that's happening in China at the moment in this part of the world, I can't complete that field trip, and I only can pass on my best wishes and hope for the future of friends and colleagues in that region. So, Khotan, well, today I'm going to really give an archaeological survey of what's happened over the past century in the discovery of the archaeological remains of this kingdom and where we're at with understanding where it sits in terms of the Silk Road. Oh, sorry. Now, in 1924, John Marshall, who was then the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, compared Schliemann with Stein. Schliemann, the great archaeologist, who probably is a very well-known name, with Aurel Stein for his work, Stein's work in the deserts of Turkestan, who lit upon the remains of a long-forgotten civilization. This was almost 100 years ago, after Stein had carried out 3 expeditions in this area. Aurel Stein, can I ask how many of you know the name? Probably many of you here today, because you're all quite a well-versed audience in this part of the world. But when I speak to general people, they might have heard of Schliemann, they probably haven't heard of Stein. So I won't go in, you know all about Aurel Stein, born in Budapest, naturalized British, worked for the British in India, and carried out many excavations in India, Pakistan, Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, and other places. He was working and living in British India at the end of the 19th century. Now, he's not unknown to the Society. In fact, in, I think, 1922, the then president of the Society, Charles Reed, gave his presidential address on Stein's second expedition to the deserts of Turkestan, so almost 100 years ago. And in 1935, he was awarded the gold medal of the Society, again, linking, foregrounding his works in the Central Asian desert and his excavations among its sand-buried cities. There's rewritten a long chapter in the history of Asiatic civilization, which have been lost. I'm not certain how much more has been done over the century since Stein. I'm working on a book of Khotan simply because there isn't one. There isn't a single monograph history on this kingdom, or indeed any of the other kingdoms of the Taklamakan, despite their importance and their centrality. I wish somebody else would write it, but nobody has. So if anybody out there on Zoom or wherever wants to do it, please let me know, and I can go away to doing other things and just writing articles. Anyway, so the deserts of Central Asiatic deserts, where are we talking about? Well, we're talking about this area here, looking at a map of Afro-Eurasia. We see the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, and everything to the south, and to the north, the steppe, and then Central Asian mountains of the Pamir and the Karakoram and Hindu Kush off to the west. If we look at this more closely, we can see the topography of the region. And I guess some of you might, well, I know some of you might have been there, but for those of you who haven't, it's the second largest sand desert in the world, with sand dunes that are sometimes 400 or 500 meters high. So it's a very difficult desert to to explore and to excavate in, is also almost devoid of life and water in the center. You can see that the Kunlun come down, Kunlun Mountains at the north of the Tibetan Plateau come along the south. And then you have the Karakoram from where this river, the Tarim, flows. And this is, of course, called the Tarim Basin because it's a basin of the Tarim River, which flows all the way along the northern side of the Taklamakan and debouches originally into a lake over here, although it's long dried out. It doesn't go that far. To the north, you have the Tian Shan and then the steppe, as said, to the west, the Karakoram, and to the south, coming from the Kunlun Mountains, you have various rivers. And Khotan is the oasis here on these two rivers that come down from the mountain and then rejoin in the desert. And at some point, traverse the desert. It's usually dry now, so they're dry past about this area here. Importantly, it's a difficult place to access because you have very high mountains to the west and south. The Kunlun are very barren, so it's very difficult to travel through them. You have to go over high mountain passes to go westward. North, you can get to the steppe. You still have to pass over mountains, but not so formidable. And to the east, you have this little corridor of land called the Hershey, now called the Hershey Corridor, west of the river, west of the Yellow River, which is strategically very important. To the south, there are mountains, north of the desert. So it's one little corridor which allows for the movement of large numbers of people out of this eastern end of the Taklamakan. I should also say another point about this desert is it's quite high. So Khotan is about 1,300 meters. So it gets very, very hot and very, very cold in the winter. Now, Stein was to carry out 4 expeditions in this area. The fourth one, 1930, was aborted because of a changed political situation. He was in effect thrown out. But on all of them, he went to these areas in the south that once formed the kingdoms of Khotan, Kadota, and Karena. And this was his primary area of interest when he first started to think about excavating in this area, because these were kingdoms that were between different empires and different cultures. Stein himself had studied Indian and Iranian culture and languages, and so he expected to see both Indian and Iranian influences in this area, but as well as Turkic influences coming from the north, and of course Tibetan from the south, the Tibetan Plateau, and Chinese from the east. Khotan had been known for a long time. Obviously it was, but it had been mentioned in very early Chinese sources, well, early first millennium BC Chinese sources, as a place which was the source of jade. And jade was very important to the cultures, the early cultures in the Chinese plains. And we have jade. It wasn't the only source of jade, Khotan, but it was a main and very prized source because the jade there was said to be very good. And it ranged from completely white to almost black jade. I mean, jade doesn't come just in the color jade. And from very early times, so in Liangzhu, in the eastern seaboard of China, up here, we see this piece excavated from the mid-3rd millennium BC. This is a disc with a hole in the center that is called a B in Chinese. It's not clear what its function is, but they're found in great numbers in graves, early graves. Jade was associated with longevity and immortality, so it's associated often with burials and the dead. So in the tomb a bit later, tomb of the queen, Fu Hao, up here a bit further north than Liangzhu, who was buried in about 1250 BC. There are over 750 jades in her tomb. And this is one of them, the little elephant on the top right, little carved elephant. And then the king of Nam Viet, the southern Nam, what is now the edge of Vietnam, of course, Jiao, who died in 128 BC, was buried in a suit of jade. You see it in the bottom left. This was borrowing a practice from the kings to the north, and again associated with keeping the body and the immortality of jade, stopping the body decaying. And this was made up of, I think, about 1,500 pieces, maybe over 2,000, little plaques of jade sewn together with red string. This is from the jade, and this is original. The red string is new, obviously. It's from an exhibition that was in the Fitzwilliam a few years ago. But these jade suits are found throughout. So you can imagine the quantity of jade that was coming out from Khotan. Now, Khotan is mentioned at this time as the source of jade, and the people who traded it, who brought it to the cultures of what is now China, are mentioned as living in the Hershey Corridor, in this little tract of land here, the Yuezhi, and they're quite important for our story. We see jade going west, but it's less obvious in the Iranian plateau and other areas in West Asia. It does start being seen used in sword pommels like this one here. This is in a collection, so we haven't got clear provenance from it, so the dating is very uncertain. But certainly in the first few centuries AD, we start to see jade coming in this area, and it's usually been said that it's because of the influence of the Yuezhi bringing it, because of their long familiarity with jade from the Khotan. Now, the Yuezhi are very important in the story of the Silk Road and indeed of Khotan, because, well, when we're talking about the Silk Road, what the narrative you'll often get is that the Chinese sent Zhang out in 138 BC. He went to Central Asia. He found lots of wonderful things. He came back with intelligence, and the Chinese started trading westward. Well, that's a very Sinocentric view of the Silk Road, and obviously it's a nice little episode, but things don't work quite like that. Zhang Qian's mission was important. Zhang Qian was indeed sent out in 138 BC with a mission of 100 people. It was a military mission sent from the Han Empire, which had been formed just some 70 years before, because what had happened was that the big empire, big steppe empire, the Xiongnu, had moved down and taken control of the Hershey Corridor, which stopped, well, one result of this is that they pushed the Yuezhi, forced them to migrate, and they migrated to this place originally north of the Tian Shan Mountains. It also stopped easy access for the Han soldiers and others to go westward through this Hershey Corridor. So the Han actually sent Zhang Qian on a mission to persuade the Yuezhi on a joint attack of the Xiongnu, Yuezhi from the west, the Han from the east, so that they could repel them from this very strategic little point of land. In fact, of course, Zhang Qian had to go through this strategic little point of land to get to the Yuezhi, and not surprisingly, he and his compatriots were all captured. They were kept in captivity by the Xiongnu for 10 years or more. He took a Xiongnu wife, he had a child. He eventually escaped, or was allowed to go on. He eventually got to where he thought the Yuezhi were. In fact, Chinese intelligence was not very good, because they'd moved some decades before from this place down to what is now northern Afghanistan, to Bactria. So he moved on and eventually found them in their new homeland. And they, of course, weren't at all interested in any military mission against the Xiongnu back further east. But said, as a result of his mission, he did come out with lots of intelligence about the peoples, the cultures, the goods and everything in Central Asia and further west and northern India. This is important because then the Han Empire, it carried on with its diplomatic and military relations with the Xiongnu, and eventually managed to, in one series of successful military campaigns, managed to repel it from the Hershey Corridor. So it opened the way for them to send armies and set up garrisons in this Taklamakan, in the Tarim Basin. And this, of course, was over the next sort of century. And at the same time, the Yuezhi moved further south and expanded and formed by the 1st century AD, the Kushan Empire, which I think is far more important, is far more of a key event when we're looking at the start of regional trade and interaction across Afro-Eurasia, because the Kushan for the first time really united this whole mountainous region of Central Asia and enabled and encouraged movement of trade, movement of other peoples such as Buddhist pilgrims and others, both north-south and east-west. So from India up to the steppe, and of course from the Iranian plateau across the mountains to the Tarim and thence to China. And so this is much more, I think, a key moment in the start of the Silk Road. But Khotan was obviously very related to the Yuezhi through their jade industry. And it also had, as we know, lots of interest with Kushan. And this is what excited and interested Stein. When the Han Empire sent garrisons, sent soldiers to that region, they kept basic records, and these appeared in the Chinese histories. So we always have a history, a chapter on the history of the Western regions from then in Chinese histories. And they have little paragraphs like Khotan is a thriving kingdom with a population of 5,032, and it practices this, and everybody has a stupa outside their door or whatever. That was a bit later, but it gives us a little paragraph snapshot of these kingdoms. Fascinating, but doesn't tell us a lot about them, but shows something of their populations and their spread at the time. Now, let's go forward 2,000 years to the time of Stein at the end of the 19th century, when this area was very much the remit of great empires, and this time the British, the Russian, and then to the south, the Manchu Empire, which formed the Qing dynasty, and of course Persians. And then we have poor Afghanistan in the center, the yellow, which is kept sort of pressed between all these empires, and the little Wakhan corridor, which created to stop the British and the Russians having a boundary, really an area of Tajik peoples, for the first time now actually occupied by the Taliban, and obviously also strategically very important as sharing a border with all these places and with China. And in fact, China's now got plans to build a road there. But you can see the relative positions of Kashgar and Khotan and how important they were. Well, the Great Game through the 19th century meant that travel, exploration, excavation in this area was very, very difficult, if not impossible. But by the end of the 19th century, of course, there was a bit of a rapprochement, and both the British and the Russians sent out representatives to Kashgar. Russians first sent out a consul, and then George Macartney went out. Oh, this is just to show Afghanistan caught between the, Schiller and Chibris of the British lion and the Russian bear. Macartney was sent out, or found his way there with a young husband expedition, and took him a little while to get official status recognized, but he was the unofficial representative in Kashgar, with Petrovsky being the Russian representative. I put this picture in because it's a wonderful encapsulation of the meeting and adaptation of cultures that we see throughout the Silk Road. Because here's Macartney, who he was Scottish and Chinese. He had a Chinese mother and a Scottish father. But sitting with the local military official. And they're sitting on a Central Asian structure here, which is used for, you sit, you eat your meals on it, you do everything. It's your basic living structure, the supa and this structure. And then they're sitting on Western chairs on a seated structure. So it's this adaptation of two different cultures. I also stick this picture in because you can see the little boy of the household. He's just peeked through the curtain just at the right time, got himself immortalized in the frame. But anyway, the fact that Macartney and Petrovsky were there meant that it became possible for people to start going out. And explorers and scholars started going to this region. And also, this showed local people, there was an interest in the artifacts and the archaeology and the finds of this region. So they started bringing things to the Russian and British consul. One of the most interesting things, and we only have a black and white photograph of it from the time because it's not known where it is today, is a manuscript that was given to explorers near Khotan. And it's in Central Asian script Kharosthi, in Prakrit, Gandharan, the North Indian language, and a Buddhist piece written on birch bark, which of course is not found in Khotan. It's a desert oasis, but is found in northern India. So already showing the links between Khotan and Central Asia, India at the time. So things like this have started to come out. We also have coins coming out from Khotan, very interesting coins that again have Kharosthi, Prakrit inscriptions of kings on one side with the horse on the front, and then Chinese on the back, again showing Khotan's place between these two empires. The Sino-Kharosthi coins. They should be called Kharosthi Chinese coins because the Kharosthi is the front, but they're known as Sino-Kharosthi coins. And also lots of strange manuscripts like this, which nobody could quite work out. There were two people from Khotan who sold these to the Russian and British consuls. There was one, Islam al-Khun, who sold them to Macartney, and another man, a colleague, who sold them to the Russians. And they realized there was competition between the Russians and the British. So they were able to build on that and keep coming out with more and more of these types of things in an unknown language, a script which looked something like Brahmi, but didn't look quite right. A lot of these went off to scholars such as Hernley in Calcutta, who then spent the next decade trying to decipher them in the hope of finding a new language. So there was exciting stuff coming out. Also lots of reports about buried cities in the sands of the Taklamakan. So Stein, cut a long story short, because he had to find his funding and get leave and blah, 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 managed to get out on his first expedition, 1900, 1901. And this is after modified of one of Stein's maps, because he also did surveying of the region. You can see the Khotan mountains coming down to the oasis and the two rivers, and then another river, the Keria River, just to the east. The capital of the ancient Khotan was thought to be here. There's been a bit of discussion about whether it was this place, Yotkan, but there or thereabouts. It's general, that hasn't been strongly negated. So Stein went there hoping to find one of these walled cities that were mentioned in the Chinese reports. In fact, and I'll show this map later, but we're going to be looking today at some of the sites such as Rawak up here and Dandan Oilik, the place I was meant to visit, and Karadong, Keria River, and a bit of Nia here, this kingdom of Kadota, adjacent to Khotan. This is what Yotkan was like. It was fields, agricultural fields. There'd been a lot of digging down. There'd been a lot of panning for gold. There is gold up in the Kunlun Mountains, but it's also thought that a lot of the gold that people found, locals found, actually came from the ruins of the ancient stupas, which we know from reports, contemporary reports, the domes of the stupas were covered with gold, and they were enormous stupas. So there must have been a lot of wealth there. And as they collapsed and disintegrated into the desert, the gold got buried with them. So there wasn't any chance of doing excavation, and there never has been. I mean, this site has never been excavated. It's assumed that most of what was there has long been lost in terms of remains of buildings and the like. But what did come out from this place and continues to today are tiny little terracotta figures like this. These are all British Museum pieces of animals, especially of monkeys. Monkeys are very popular, even though monkeys, of course, are not animal found in the Taklamakan desert, but they come with Buddhism and India and those links, camels and horses, other things. beads, agate and glass beads, lots of beads, sort of things you would find in a disturbed site, but also some nice intaglios like these. These are probably agate, and on the bottom right, you can see a piece of lapis. Lapis, of course, comes from what is now Eastern Afghanistan, from Badakhshan, main lapis mines there. So across the mountains, but quite close to Khotan, and of course has been traded from this area since ancient times. We see it, for example, in Tutankhamun's death mask, so to North Africa from thousands of years, 4,000 years ago. Also found more of these coins, which proved to be very important for the understanding of Khotan, because they've given us quite a lot of information about its chronology and its kings from the names on the coins. And other coins like this. This is one found by Stein, but I'll show you one that's in slightly better condition from elsewhere. It's a copper coin, but issued by one of the Kushan emperors, Kanishka I, and so in the second century, showing very clearly that the links again between Kushan and Khotan. Now, having not found anything of great interest at Yotkan, Stein moved on and went to, as said, various different sites in the desert, more remote sites away from the agriculture. This is what those of you who haven't been, sites in this part of the world look like. Sticks in the sand, as my colleague said. This is what you come across. And you can see the sand has completely filled the sites, but often you can see the plan of the buildings. This turns out to be a walled enclosure, as was mentioned in the early Chinese histories. It's a caradong on the neighboring river, the Keria River. And when it's excavated, this is Stein's plan of what it would, what he excavated. So a walled city, but not anything very grand. Now, it's interesting because there's been a certain amount of archaeology. There was a long gap in archaeology, but in the 70s, 80s onwards, it sort of revived again. And there's been several major multi-year excavations, including one, a Sino-French excavation in this area, in Caradong. And they visited Caradong, they re-excavated, they found other temples nearby, Buddhist temples, and we'll look at a find from that. So this is Corinne and Idris in, Corinne in Paris and Idris in Xinjiang. But then Stein had mentioned that it seemed as if settlements went further north up the Keria River, now just desert, but he didn't have the time or the manpower, whatever, to go further north and excavate. The Sino-French team a few years ago went there and have excavated and uncovered this great city at Jumbalak Kum, which dates from the sort of 4th to 1st centuries BC. This is the side of the gate, and there's books written about this, and you can see the pictures in more detail. But you can see it's quite massive structures. And this is a reproduction by one of the members of the team of what the south gate of this walled city would have looked like based on their finds. So it is a substantial city, 4th to 1st century BC, in what is now the middle of the Taklamakan. There's no water there now. There must have been water there. The river must have continued up there with water at that time. It's a substantial structure. It's also a very heavily fortified structure, which accords with what we hear from the Chinese records. And this is one of many, many finds. But again, it starts to show something of the scale of these Silk Road kingdoms, Taklamakan kingdoms. There's also been quite a lot of other archaeology by Germans and Chinese and others in this region. And one site which just sticks out is Sampula, which is a grave site from 1st century AD or thereabouts, and have lots of interesting finds. It's right down near, as you can see, near the oasis in Khotan. And I just put up one of the finds here again to show these links across the mountains to the west with their kingdoms. This is a pair of trousers that were found in the tomb. They've been sewn and cut and everything, so you can see that they're trousers, but the motif on them and the way they're done, it's thought that they originally are wall hanging probably from Bactria, from across the mountains. And that at some point they found their way either as a wall hanging or already cut into pieces to the peoples here in Khotan. And they have they've got a centaur at the top. This is postulated by many people to be a Uedra warrior, the figure with his spear, but it's hypothesis. But again, you can see the Hellenistic influence of Central Asia at this time coming across. So all sorts of interesting things going on here, and we could explore these just by themselves, but obviously we don't have time. Now, the other important thing about this region was that Buddhism moved there. From the time of the Kushan, Buddhism had moved from northern India into what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it started to move across into the Taklamakan. And after Buddhism had moved into central China, we see hundreds, if not thousands, of pilgrims making their way from China to the sites, Buddhist sites in northern India, and going through the Tarim. And several of them left quite detailed travelogues about their journeys. So Fa Xian, who is traveled right at the beginning of the 5th century, or possibly end of the 4th century, wrote, for example, and you can see that he comes down to Khotan here, he wrote, "A pleasant and prosperous kingdom with numerous and flourishing population." And interestingly, he says each house has a small stupa in front of its door. So it shows the level of faith of these people, Buddhist faith. And well, we can see the size of Buddhism by the fact that he says the king lodged Fa Xian and the others in a monastery with 3,000 monks. So a substantial monastery. And this was just one, we know, of perhaps a dozen, 20 monasteries in that area. So this was a substantial Buddhist kingdom. So Stein expected to find Buddhist ruins, and indeed he wasn't to be disappointed. This is a stupa. For any of you who don't know, a stupa is a Buddhist reliquary. So from Sanchi, it's originally a burial mound, and it develops. It's a place where you keep bones of the Buddha or bones or saints, or they're used then to mark important sites, parts of the Buddha's lives and everything. So they're a living shrine. I mean, stupas are places you go and worship. You go and leave your votive offering. You leave your piece of silk on top of the dome of the stupa. You buy some gold to help the dome be covered in gold. This is a perimeter around a stupa called Rawak, which is just to the northeast of Yotkan. But now in the desert, it's only a day's journey, but it's in desert. There's no agriculture around it or other cultivation. And you can see this perimeter wall, 2 perimeter walls, which were lined on both sides with these figures. Sorry, this is a Stein picture, and he normally puts a rule so you can see the sign, size, dimensions, but these are above life size. They're sort of 8-10 foot. So massive sculptures going around this perimeter of this stupa. Sadly, most of these are now lost for various reasons, but a big undertaking, an expensive undertaking, shows the community must have been large and wealthy enough to sustain, well, to build and then sustain a building like this. This is what it looks like today, or in 2008. You can get some idea then of the size of the stupa and this perimeter wall from the figures. Now, something to note about this stupa is that you can probably just about see, it has staircases going up to the platform on all sides. So you can see 2 of them here. This is a form of stupa that we see starting to come into Gandhara. This is the Bamala Stupa in Taxilla. You can see it's got the same staircases on 4 sides, so they're much disintegrated, the 1st to 4th centuries. And then in the Swat Valley, further up to the north, on one of the routes to Central Asia, now Pakistan, this is a fantastic stupa, which Stein actually also visited and worked at on another of his expeditions to this region. Amlakdara Stupa. Just to give an idea of the scale, these are wheelbarrows. So you can start to see that this was a massive structure in the Swat Valley. I don't know whether any of you have been to the Swat Valley. Beautiful place, but now quite remote. But this is not a structure that's built by villagers. It's a structure that's built by rulers and rich people. And this is one of 20, 30 stupas in this valley along quite a small area, all radiating out from the central Swat River. It's one of the best preserved. But it also has, as you see, the 4 staircases. So this was a stupa form that came from Gandhara. You can see its progression very clearly, and was replicated, was copied in the deserts of the Taklamakan. So we can quite clearly see this progression of peoples and cultures and architectural styles coming with Buddhism into places like Khotan. I just want to give you an idea of the scale. Stupas now, they would have originally had these chakras on top, which would have made them much, much larger. You can see this is a model stupa, but it shows the platform and then the various, the stupa with various friezes around it, and then these chakras on top. In Amlakdara, it would have made it half as high again as originally. And these chakras, which are made of stone, these great big stone discs, weighing over a ton in weight, the biggest of them, were found broken on the floor around the stupa because they'd long fallen off. But again, just to give an idea of, get a sense of the logistics and the organization needed to build something like this. Not complicated structure, but just to get the chakras on top of this dome must have required quite a lot of expertise and people. So it would have looked a very forbidding, not very forbidding, a very imposing structure in the Swat Valley, just as Rawak would have looked very imposing in the desert for pilgrims and for others traveling by. Now, I've got to rush through lots of Stein things because he went on 4 expeditions, so he has lots and lots and lots of stuff. But he also found many other Buddhist remains, monasteries and small shrines such as this. This is in Dan Oilik, the place I haven't got to, and many other artifacts, which seem to confirm some of the stories that were that were known about Khotan. So there's a story about Khotan that it's a place that first developed sericulture outside China. This is, there's a story that goes around that China kept knowledge of sericulture to itself and that it leaked out by the Silk Princess, one story shown here, it's thought, who was sent to marry the king of Khotan from China. And when the envoy came to accompany her back across the desert to Khotan, he said, you won't be able to wear your silk clothes. We've only got wool and cotton and these other things in the desert. And she said, oh, horrors, I can't wear those clothes. I have to have silk. Wasn't allowed to take silk out for the princess. So she hid, the story goes, cocoons of silk cocoons and mulberry seeds, seeds of the mulberry tree or whatever, in her headdress. And here she's shown with her assistant, with her maidservant pointing to her headdress. And this was a plaque, and you've got the god of silk to her left, just on the right here. So this was thought to be a confirmation of this story. In fact, silk did come out, sericulture did come out to Khotan. It became a producer of silk. There's no evidence that China ever stopped it coming out. In fact, they sent people to neighboring cultures to teach them sericulture. With sericulture, obviously, you have to have mulberries as well, so you have to have moriculture. to feed your silkworms. And we do have ancient mulberry orchards still surviving. I mean, they're not living trees, they're fossilized trees, but in this region. The fact that we have silk in this area is also shown by some wonderful finds made by the Sino-French team quite recently in Caradong, where Stein was, in one of these Buddhist temples I mentioned that they'd discovered, small Buddhist temples. And they found these wall paintings of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas shown at the top, with wearing what are assumed to be resist-dyed cotton garments, typical of Indian textiles. So shown in these Indian textiles, but at the same site, they found remains of garments which match the pattern, resist-dyed garments which match the pattern shown on these wall paintings, but which aren't made of cotton, they're made of discontinuous silk. Discontinuous silk, when you cultivated silk, obviously the cocoon, when the pupa is in it, is thrown into your pot of boiling water before it hatches so that you get a continuous piece of thread. The pupa hasn't had a chance to break out and stretch or break the cocoon. So you get a continuous piece of thread, a kilometer long from one cocoon. It's said that some people are against the killing of the cocoon in Buddhist places, and we still have a product called peace silk, which does the same, so that instead of killing the pupae, they allowed it to hatch, and then you had more broken or distorted silk. And this is made from that sort of silk, from discontinuous silk. So then it has to be spun like wool or cotton or other discontinuous threads. So it's a very different thing, and it doesn't have the strength, but it suggests that this was local silk using an Indian form of dyeing and Indian patterns seen on the mantles of these wall paintings from the same site. So it's a really nice find. In fact, we've also found in textiles which were probably made in India and textiles which were made in West Asia at the same site. Also, Stein found things like this, a little votive plaque on the left showing two riders. He found this at Dandan Oilik, and again, more recent excavations found another wall painting, another temple at Dandan Oilik with this wall painting, which has exactly the same motif running along the bottom. And in fact, another recent excavation, discovery of a small temple in Demoko, much further south from this, also has exactly the same motif. Now, Joanna Williams, in one of the few books about Khotan, discussed this. She did her thesis at Harvard, and then she wrote a long article in 1973 discussing the iconography, the significance, where this motif of the blackbird flying into the bowl came from. She gives it Turkic origins. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but until we have more evidence, it's very difficult to tell. What can be said is you don't see this motif in any of the neighboring cultures. You see it in Khotan, and it occurs in several instances. It's not random, over a period of time. So it's clearly a very, very important motif that has significance for Khotan. Whether we will ever be able to know that significance is difficult to say. But what we can say is that it shows Khotan had its own art, its own ideas, its own stories, its own myths. Now, just to whiz on, because I haven't got much time, Stein also found lots of documents on wood, on paper, on silk, on other materials. This is a document actually in Kharoshti in Prakrit from the neighboring kingdom of Nia, but it concerns sending a gift of a horse to the king of Khotan. So it shows the relation between those two kingdoms. Lots of documents like this. This is a legal document written in the language which was then unknown, Khotanese, Eastern Iranian language. And very nice piece. I can come back to it if you're interested. But also pieces like this, and both these found in Dandan Oilik, Judeo-Persian document about the sale of sheep. So written in Hebrew script, but in Persian language. And in fact, a few of these have been found in this region here and in further east in Dunhong. So possibly show the existence of Jewish traders, Radhanite Jewish traders in this area as well. It's very difficult to read because of beginning and end of the sentences. And also just more everyday things. So this is a letter in Khotanese from a farmer who's been posted under the Tibetan period when the Tibetan Empire ruled this area in the 9th century to a Tibetan fort, and he's writing back to his wife and he's saying, well, I think it's interesting because it shows that they were used to literacy, even they had access to literacy, even if he used a scribe to write this letter and send it to his wife. He and his wife both had access to reading and writing. And the letter basically says, you must look after the farm and don't forget to water the pomegranates. They need lots of watering at this time of the year. You have to do this and get in all the things. Anyway, it's just quite a nagging letter from her husband to make sure that she's doing all the right things. And he also says, I know you want our son to help you on the farm, but I need him here, so send him up to me because I need his services. So it's just a little glimpse of life, the time when he's posted by the Tibetan rulers to a faraway place. Now, just to give you an idea, this is a map done by German colleagues to show the number of languages, manuscripts found, languages and scripts found in this area. Khotan is obviously down here on the left, but you can get an idea of the richness of the cultures represented just by the number of languages we find in this area. Stein didn't find anything like this, nor did any of his colleagues. This, if you remember, was a manuscript sold to Macartney by Islam al-Khan. Stein had already, and Hernley, who was Stein's mentor, had been trying to decipher these for the past 10 years. Stein had always been a bit skeptical, as were others, including Swedish missionaries in the area. And he managed to track down the seller of this and other manuscripts, Islam al-Khan. He sat him in a room for 3 days and shone a light in his eyes and questioned him. And eventually Islam al-Khan admitted he made a mistake. I mean, he contradicted himself, and then it all came out that in fact, he and his mate had just made these things because they realized that the consuls were very interested in old things, and they took a lot of care with them to begin with, copying other ones, genuine ones they found. Then they just gave up giving any care because they realized nobody looked at them, and they just used little wood blocks and used tea or whatever and smoke to age the paper. We have boxes of these in the British Library, as does the St. Petersburg Institute of Oriental Studies, the Russian British ones. Interesting in their way, because they probably use local paper. So for 19th, 20th century paper making in Khotan, a tradition which goes back to the time of the Silk Road, it would be interesting to look at them from that point of view and, you know, from other points of view. Okay, I just want to say quickly, because I know you want me to finish, that as well as going to these places on the southern Taklamakan, on his second expedition, Stein went further east to a place called Dunhong, which was, as most of you will know, a place of rock-cut Buddhist temples dating from 400 to 1400. And he found there great evidence of the Khotanese, who were very close in the 9th, 10th centuries with the Dunhong kings, and there were lots of intermarriages. And on the walls of the caves, cave temples, you find Khotanese donors, pictures of the Khotanese king with his jade and gold headdress. Also, most importantly, perhaps in this area, there was a little discovery of a small library cave, this walled up chapel that had originally been built for a Buddhist monk who died in the 9th century. And for some reason, his statue was moved out, and sometime in the 10th century, it was filled with manuscripts, printed documents, and paintings. This is what it looked like in 1908 when the French sinologist explorer Paul Pelliot was in it with a candle. Oh, this is a paper archive, but that didn't happen, fortunately. Otherwise, I'd be telling a different story. But this is after Stein had been and acquired by various negotiations and a handover of small amount of cash, a lot of manuscripts from this place, which are now in the British Library and other places. And they include a lot more documents in Khotanese. This, interestingly, is a Khotanese Chinese phrase book. So the Chinese is shown in Khotanese script, transcribed in Khotanese script, and then the phrase is given, the translation is given in Khotanese itself. Not Khotanese script, Brahmi script, but in read as Khotanese would read it. So again, just showing something about everyday life of people moving between these two kingdoms. I should say Khotan to Dunhong is about 1,500 kilometers. It's quite a long distance. But many, many other documents, including Buddhist documents that were unknown before, written in Khotanese, showing that Khotanese had its own literature, its own Buddhist tradition, and we know of Buddhist documents coming from Khotan to China and being translated there. Just to say a bit about the form of manuscripts, these are on paper, and they're in the form, the Poti form, which of course was originally made in this format because it was from Indian manuscripts on palm leaf. And in fact, this is an Indian manuscript on palm leaf, also found in Dunhong, but it replicates this form in paper and keeps the space for the string hole, even though it's redundant. But we also see them, the scroll form used. So this is a long Khotanese scroll with rather beautiful silk on the front. And Khotanese donors to banners like this. There's a Khotanese inscription just down here to this banner, which is now in the Met Museum, but probably found by Stein at this period. Now, I hope I've just given you a little snapshot to show you how tantalizing Khotan is. We have this place which is obviously full of self-confidence, has its own stories, its own foundation myths, its own language, its own art, its own Buddhist works, its own literature. And we know very little about it. It lasted, probably formed 3rd, 2nd centuries BC. We don't know. We know it was around, as said, at the time of the first Chinese histories. But it lasted. We do know the end date of the kingdom because in 1006, the Karakhanids from the northwest came down and conquered Khotan. And this is often given as the reason, the possible reason for the sealing up of the library cave in Dunhong, because Dunhong were anxious also about invaders coming to them, because they, after all, were very close to Khotan. That's just speculation. No one really knows. After that, it continues to have an identity, but it becomes a more Uyghur area, moving from the north. It becomes primarily Islamic by the 13th century, but the remains, the archaeological remains, survive because they're mainly in remote parts of the deserts. They're not built over, they're not used for other things. So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of documents, a lot of archaeology reports in other histories and secondary documents, and yet we're still completely in the dark, I would say, or almost completely in the dark about Khotan. And, well, as I said, I hope today I've given you some idea of the richness of this Silk Road kingdom, which Stein himself called a kingdom of remarkable diversity, and that you'll agree with me in that it deserves a monograph of its own. Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I imagine that you've probably had some being typed into Zoom as we've been talking. Would that be right? Should we start with a question from the virtual audience? Oh, we're still waiting. Okay, that's fine. Any questions from the real in-person audience? Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little more about what perhaps one could call the political anthropology of this area, the relationship between kingdoms. Is there a hierarchy? an extent of political, military, or whatever dominance or lack of it, and so on?
The hierarchy of cultures in this area, say.
Cultures, or more specifically?
Well, remember, we were talking well over 1,000 years of history and many different peoples and many different kingdoms. It didn't stay the same. It was very mutable. So, but short answer, I would say no. Not that you can say in that clear-cut way. The kingdoms tended to be oases, the early kingdoms, oasis kingdoms, that their territories stretched as far as the oasis stretched, as far as their water and their irrigation canals. And they tended, from what we know, to have good, friendly relationships with the neighborhood kingdoms. I mean, there were times, Khotan expanded. There were wars. We see it expanding as far as Kashgar, for example, at one point, and certainly into Kadota in the east. But, you know, they don't become great empires. What we do see is the empires from all the different areas coming and taking dominance. So there's discussion about whether the Kushan actually, they certainly had a lot of influence in this area in the first, second centuries AD. And some scholars think that they actually ruled this area. I think they probably sent people, to the kingdoms, but whether they actually ruled in the sense that we would understand. But certainly the Chinese came in from the east at various times, and during the First Tibetan Empire in the 8th to 9th centuries, the Tibetan moved into Khotan. And actually we have some good Tibetan sources on Khotan as well. But no, not, we don't see any particular cultural group dominating at this early period. I mean, that's why it's so interesting, because of all these different cultural groups existing to the limits of their oasis kingdoms. You've got limited resources. You can't become a great empire with an oasis kingdom. Well, quite difficult. You don't have the manpower, you don't have the resources. And why would you anyway? So.
Can you tell us what the latest finds are from these sites? Do the manuscripts run into the later in the medieval period, or?
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't
of
talk much about timing. Most of the finds are, well, from the 1st to 10th centuries, from the first millennium AD.
Yes.
I mean, of course, there's been earlier finds of manuscripts in Afghanistan, and some of the manuscripts can't be clearly dated, but it's generally thought 1st to 10th century. And of course, that's the date of the Dunhong finds, because it's thought that the cave was sealed after that area.
And was there just a general decline in?
Oh, well, no, the oasis, it's interesting because, you know, these weren't places like Pompeii that were suddenly taken over. They were, yeah, general, not necessarily quick decline, but settlement areas rely on irrigation, agriculture. So you rely on water. And the water comes down from the Kunlun in the spring and summer melt. There's nothing to channel it. You know, this is gravel, glacier, and then sand. So it just goes in the direction it finds. So you have flash floods which destroy places, or you have a move of a watercourse which just goes in a different direction, and you don't have the manpower to channel it into your canals. So you have to abandon your place and move somewhere else. So what we tend to have from these places, especially the towns such as at Nia, are what you left when you move house. You take everything of value and you have your black bin bag. So we have broken mouse traps and bits of scraps of rug and things like that. You know, we have the detritus, what's left. So we don't have the great finds, the great treasures. But no, on the whole, they didn't move quickly, but I mean, in a season or two because of water. And then, yeah, as I said, the Khotanese were actually invaded by the Karakhanids, and then there's a whole different story. They still retain some identity, and the Yarkand, which is an area just to the west of them, Khanate, has a story through Mongol period and into the 20th century. So it still retains some Khotanese identity through the latter part, through the second millennium, but as independent or semi-autonomous kingdoms, it's first millennium mainly, and maybe a bit before, we don't know.
But Islamic for the most part. After,
Later,
or-
but from 13th century later, yeah, only really. In fact, we have reports of rebellions by uprisings by Buddhists in Khotan, I think in the 11th century against Islamic, the introduction of Islam in that area. So, yeah. But there wasn't any, we have no evidence of any great destruction of the Buddhist structures.
Sorry, I'm just finding it. So this question is just a follow on from your last question, and you have answered most of it. But the person was just wondering what types of tools and weapons have been recorded.
Oh, yes, interesting. Again, because stuff was left behind. So, it's interesting looking at this period of archaeology because, of course, archaeology wasn't a professional discipline and people were just finding their way. We're very lucky with Stein in that he was someone who read all the latest archaeological reports and methods and suggestions. And on his second expedition to this region, he goes to a fort and finds all these little bits of lacquer, squares of lacquered leather with patterns on about this size. And he says, oh, I'd come across stuff like this in my first expedition, but I just threw it to one side because I didn't think it was of significance. But by then he's learned that everything is of significance. So he's great because he does keep everything. Anyway, those little pieces of lacquered leather are in fact armor. We found very few weapons because they wouldn't have been left behind in this sort of context. They were valued and taken. So we find bits of heads of halberds or spears or whatever, but very, very little weaponry. So tools, yeah, again, we find things like milk churns and beating, what do you call those things? Combs for beating carpets and things like that, weaving tools, agricultural tools, implements. Broken little pieces, sometimes it's difficult to recognize. You show these bits of wood. In fact, I'm just trying to track down two pieces that Stein thought were part of a loom. They were just two pieces of wood, and they should be somewhere in the British Museum, but unless they were marked as that when they came, they just look like two pieces of wood. So, it's very difficult sometimes to know what are tools and parts of other things once they're broken up. So there probably is more, but it needs to be there and it needs to have been kept. So.
I have a couple more from online if I can be cheeky. Okay, yeah, this one is, to what extent are Chinese archaeologists working in or interested in Khotan today?
There's been, the teams I've worked with have been teams from the Xinjiang Institute of Archaeology, which is Chinese archaeologists. They tend to be mixed Uyghur, Han Chinese, but over in the past. And they've done quite a lot of excavation in this region. So they are interested. It's very, and there's been there's been Sino-Japanese excavations of near very big reports coming out from that. So there's been some very, very good archaeology over, said, the 70s and 80s and past couple of decades. It'll be interesting to see what comes out in the next decade. So there has been good work. It's very difficult archaeology, and a lot of the archaeologists in that region end up doing a lot of rescue archaeology because of the road building and other things. So they're called out to do, emergency archaeology, the roads built through a site. So they all have, when you drive through the desert, they all say, oh, there's that walled city over there, but we never have time or resources to look at that, and so on. So there's, yeah, there's fantastic places still to find. There's also quite a lot of robbery, and even though these sites are in the middle of the desert, they're impossible to police because they're in the middle of the desert. But I remember going to one site, I mean, our trucks broke down, we had to walk quite a long time to get there. And a tomb site, they'd all been pulled up and the coffin scattered and the bones scattered and things taken. And the guardian of the site was a man from the local village, which was several hours drive through the desert away. So he did what he could, but you know, you can't police something like that. You can't build a concrete wall around it. Having said that, the Xiaohe site, which is a bit to the east, and the Tarim River, very interesting site. When they finished excavating there, it's a tomb site from the 2nd and 1st millennium BC. They built a big concrete cover over the whole site, which they could then remove later if they needed to stop it being looted or whatever, or desecrated in the meantime.
And the last one from the internet is, did jade play a role in the Khotan kingdom?
In the
Khotan kingdom.
Oh yeah, no, jade was tremendously important. As said, jade was a great source of wealth. In fact, Khotan became a trading place for gemstones in general. So with Lapis coming across, ruby, carnelian, all these different gemstones coming from the West, and jade, which they produce themselves. It continues, it's always been jade. Khotanese jade is still prized. So it's been going on for over 2,000 years. If you go to Khotan today, every second shop is a jade shop. And there's modern Chinese artists working on Khotanese jade and coming out with things. So it's still great, it's still a living tradition. And I remember the first time we went with that, we had 3 4-wheel drives, and we got to Khotan and the drivers just disappeared off. And 3 days later, when we were leaving again, they came back, and the trucks, vehicles felt slightly different. And we looked in the back, and there were these great big lumps of rock, because they'd all been searching in the rivers for pieces of jade that were going to make their fortune. It's very difficult to actually identify jade when it's in a lump of rock, but they'd taken their bets. So we had to go around with all these lumps of rock in the back of the 4-wheel drives for the rest of the journey.
Thank you. I read somewhere that I think it's about the 10th century, the then ruler of Khotan gave the ruler or somebody in China a dancing elephant that they found in Kashgar.
Yes.
Sounds like something out of Strictly, but do elephants feature, though, in Khotan itself? I'm thinking particularly war elephants, as they did in Afghanistan.
Well, the little terracotta figures I showed you, and there are elephants. They don't figure. I should say that area did have tigers. Up until Stein's day, there were still tigers in that area. But elephants weren't, you have to go further south into Southeast Asia or into India to find elephants. So they know about them, and they were only one of many exotic animals which traveled across the Taklamakan. So we have leopards, we have all sorts of things being sent by foreign embassies to the emperor of whatever place was ruling China at the time. So they would have seen many strange and exotic animals traveling through them. But elephants didn't figure. Monkeys figure a lot. And of course, monkeys are not indigenous to Khotan. But they come probably with Buddhism and India, of course, and tales of monkeys in Indian tales. And so we see a lot of monkeys in the art. We see, in terms of general, in the art and everything, we see a bit because of the Buddhist context of elephants, but we don't see them used widely. They're not central to Khotanese culture, I'd say. Whereas the monkeys, you can say, play a much greater part.
Thank you. Thank you. So my final job is to advertise our next evening lecture, which is next Thursday, 11th of November at 5 p.m. Stephanie Evelyn Wright speaking about Beyond the Debiles, writing disability stories from skeletons. Thank you very much.